Hello, everyone. I'm Brianna Bach, a board member of the Victoria Festival of Authors. Welcome to Stories as a Form of Medicine, featuring authors Chief Dr. Robert Joseph and Leona Prince. Though this is a virtual event, the Victoria Festival of Authors is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. We acknowledge the ancestors, hereditary leaders, and matriarchs, as well as the creators from these lands, and give thanks for the privilege of living and working here. We are committed to serving as listeners and learners. Thank you to our sponsors, the BC Arts Council, Canada Council of the Arts, the CRD, the City of Victoria, Access Copyright, the Victoria Foundation, and Monroe's Books. This event, as with all VFA's events, offers closed captioning. Please click the double C at the bottom of your screen to view the captions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions for us for the authors during the event. The moderator will be able to get to some of these questions near the end of the panel. Speaking of, this panel is curated and moderated by Monique Gray-Smith. Monique is an award-winning best-selling author with 8 books that cover a broad spectrum of ages, topics, and emotions. Her most recent release is a picture book, I Hope, with Orca Book Publishers. In November, her young adult adaptation of Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer will be released. Monique is well known for her storytelling, spirit of generosity, and focus on resilience. And with that spiel out of the way, let's get started.
Thank you. Appreciate the welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, or maybe good evening, depending where you're joining us from, because I know people are joining from all over to hear our wisdom holders for this afternoon. As was said, my English name is Monique Gray-Smith, and my traditional name is Mystique Washkigos. I'm granddaughter of Noel Nanape from Papikassis First Nation in Treaty 4. My grandmother was Isabel Gray. And on my dad's side, I'm the granddaughter of Raymond Smith and Beatrice Johnstone. And mom to twins who are going to be 19 on Friday, and I'm still adjusting to that reality. I'm immensely grateful to be joining you today from the Lekwungen and Tsimshian speaking people's territory. I live kind of right in between Victoria and Saanich, and I'm grateful to raise my family here, to write here, to share stories here, and today to be joined by these 2 incredible human beings who will be sharing with us stories and our visit around how stories are a form of medicine. So let me start by introducing you to Chief Robert Joseph. Chief and Dr. Robert Joseph is a hereditary chief of the Gwawanook First Nation, Ambassador for Reconciliation Canada, and chairman of the Native American Leadership Alliance for Peace and Reconciliation. And he has sat with leaders around the globe. He was the executive director of the Indian Residential School Survivor Society and an honorary witness to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Immensely grateful you're joining us today, Chief Robert. Introduce my friend Leona Prince. Leona is from the Lake Babine Nation and Nakazali Wet'en and belongs to the Lakitsa Misu, also known as the Beaver Clan. She's a descendant of Chief Kwa and Stitch. Leona is an award-winning educator and is currently the district principal of Indigenous education for School District 91, which is the Nechako Lakes. Many of you might have also seen on our invitation to join us today was to be Angela Sterrett. She's unfortunately not able to join us today, but I really encourage you to pre-order her book that's coming out in June 2023. It's called Unbroken: My Fight for Survival, Hope, and Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls. And without question, it will be, just like Chief Robert's book and Leona's book, along with her sister Gabrielle, important contributions to literature, to the wellness of our world, and of course, to stories. So the caption for today is that stories can help us make sense of our world. They comfort us, they inspire us, they teach us, and they can give us courage to take the steps we might need to forward. Thank you for joining this panel of our authors as they share stories, including the ones they have written, and ones that might have been and may still be medicine in their lives. So much welcome to WOW, to Chief Robert and Leona. All right, would either of you like to say anything before I kind of get into questions?
I just want to start by saying I'm speaking to all of you from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, more specifically the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam. And I'm really, really honored to be on your panel today, because I believe absolutely, without question, that reconciliation in the short and long term won't start unless we start telling each other our stories.
Thank you. Leona, you want to share anything as we start?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm joining you here from New York City, and there's actually the area of the Iroquois, the Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, Oneida, and the Mohawk tribes here. It's a pleasure to be joining you to share stories. Obviously, are a huge part of our lives as Indigenous folks and as folks in general, and just happy to be invited, Masai, for having us and listening to some of the words we're going to share.
Thank you. When I think about stories, I think that, you know, there are stories that are mine, stories that I might share with my family, or that are our family stories or community stories or nation stories. And then sometimes there's stories in all of that that aren't to be shared publicly. They might be seen as sacred stories, or they might be seen as stories for people who are really close to me to learn from, but not necessarily publicly. And I think that the stories, they can transform us. They can influence our heart and our mind in ways that, like reading a textbook, really, for me anyways, doesn't do in the same way. So I'd love, as we start this afternoon, for each of you to share a reading with us. So I'm going to ask if Chief Robert, if you would start with us this afternoon. And you've identified a piece from sort of about 3/4 of the way through the book, your beautiful book, Namoyat. Just share. You can see all my stickies from.
All right. Yeah. So this will be the first time I do this. I'm so moved to be able to read this story. I'm not a productive author. This is the only book I've written. A number of years ago, a long time ago, in the early 70s, I was a reporter for the Vancouver Sun. And I was bold enough to think I was a writer or a book writer or something, as I started writing a book during my first year at the Vancouver Sun. And then after a few months, I realized that I didn't yet have a story to tell. At least not anything I was conscious of. I see differently now. I could have written a story about colonialism a long time ago, but for me, I was thinking about a personal story, and I thought, no, you haven't lived long enough. You don't have enough experience. You can't write a story. So I put it down for all those years until COVID time. And I just want to say to other potential authors thinking of writing books, don't be like me. Tell your story, period. You have a story. Everybody on earth has a story. Let me read from my book, Namoyat, and it's called From Genesis to Genesis. Storytelling is a way of life. Our Genesis stories place us on our Awitnakola, our territories from time beginning. These stories are deeply embedded in our language. In my own language of Kwakwala, there are words like Gilgalis, meaning first one here, Nuyamagiwe, meaning lead ancestor, Nuyambalis, a story throughout time and forever. So it's really true for us. Our stories began from Genesis time, and it's going to reach far into the future where every young generation speaks for itself, and they're going to tell a story, right? These are old stories, old words. The oldest carbon date of all our nations presence on the coast of British Columbia, for example, places the Hitsah First Nation on their territories, stretching back 15,000 years. In the earliest of times, these stories were told at potlatches, but also in the home or at work and in the smokehouses. In my own Kwakwaka'wakw history, these entities are intertwined through their origin stories, as well as their enjoining territories for political, social, economic, cultural, and spiritual reasons. They have sustained their allegiance to each other, and together we have shaped each other's world views. Our clearly delineated territories created a sense of membership within each clan that reinforced the meaning of belonging. Being meticulous about Genesis narratives created the very pillars of our evolution. These stories predicated and formed our spiritual practices. From time out of all of these stories came our governance structures, laws, concepts of sharing wealth. The potlatch emerged as an overarching constitutional framework to live by in the community. Ceremonial houses, our big houses, became the temples where space was held for chiefs to validate their perspectives with those who listened. Each displayed their boxes of treasures, which upheld their honor and place, and which metaphorically contained all of their rites, songs, dances, names, coppers, histories, and everything else of significance. Family laws, marriages, and adoptions were ritualized in the potlatch. Rites of passage were performed. Coming of age rituals for girls were honored. Births and deaths were marked. Names and dances were placed on family members. At the center of it all was the paramount place of the child, most of all, and the family and the community. Children were considered supernatural gifts. Among other things, the potlatch and its practices through ritual and ceremony taught us to honor universal laws of Namoyut. So I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. I love that piece that you read to us, because it really is a bridge from earlier in the book when you talk about Genesis and the origin story. So thank you very much for sharing that. Would you help us understand a little bit more about Box of Treasures?
Yeah, when a chief is, the word is not the word, inaugurated, he inherits from the chief before him, his father, his grandfather, his great grandfather, and so on, a box, which is really spoken of in metaphor. There's not per se a box, but it is a box where all of the important aspects of our lives and our laws and our relationships with each other and to the environment, how we celebrate each other, hold each other up, how we mark special occasions that I mentioned, how we honor our people who pass on to the spirit world. And it's always, and everything in that metaphorical box illustrates how everything is intended to be passed on to the next generation, so that spirit of that box is strong at all times, and that the laws that have evolved, the rules that have come about are honored because they were honored through time before this moment. And now it's our turn, when we pass it on, to have honored it in the way that our ancestors would have liked us to have honored it.
I feel like Namayut is about part of the box of treasures that you're passing on for generations.
You know what? It's absolutely essential to embrace the idea of Namayut. In everyday salutation, that's what Kwakwa people said to each other, "Kila Kesla Namayut." Greetings, my relative. And then I discovered that it meant much more than that when I was little and I went berry picking with my grandma. And we were on a little canoe paddling the banks of the Kinkum River, and there was quadam. I can't remember the English name for quadam, and their branches would hang over with these little red berries, and she would pull into the shore, and we would nudge against where she could pick these berries. But before anything, she looked to the heavens and said some words, and I was too little yet. I didn't understand that she was thanking the creator. So the berries, the forest, the fish, the fowl, the spirit world, everything and everybody were one creation, one with each other. We indeed are Namayut.
And it really, your sharing there makes me think about Leona and Gabrielle's beautiful book, illustrated by Carla Joseph. Because in here, Leona, you've shared for our littlest citizens very much what Dr. and Chief Robert has just shared with us. So I'm wondering if you would read, I think you've got a PowerPoint to share with us. Can you read "Be a Good Ancestor" for us, please?
I would love to, and follow that very beautiful passage, Miss Sai.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good segue. Okay, thought I'd share it because you absolutely have to see these illustrations if you haven't before. So be a good ancestor with water. Raindrops become puddles, puddles become streams, streams become rivers, and rivers become life. Be a good ancestor with the land. Seeds become seedlings, seedlings become trees, trees become forests, and forests become oxygen. Be a good ancestor with living things that fly. Eggs become hatchlings, hatchlings become fledglings, fledglings become eagles, eagles become iconic. Be a good ancestor with living things that swim. Eggs become fry, fry become alevins, alevin become sockeyes, and sockeyes become nourishment. Be a good ancestor with living things that walk. Newborns become cubs, cubs become young bears become grizzlies, and grizzlies become balance. Be a good ancestor with your neighbors. Neighbors become friends, friends become communities, communities become nations, and nations become allies. Be a good ancestor with your thoughts. Thoughts become ideas, ideas become actions, actions become movements, movements become change. Be a good ancestor with your words. Words become expressions, expressions become stories, stories become narratives, and narratives become truth. Be a good ancestor with your feelings. Feelings become compassion, compassion becomes understanding, understanding becomes beliefs, beliefs become values. Oh, did I miss one? Oh, no, I did not. Be a good ancestor with yourself. Children become adults, adults become leaders, leaders become elders, elders become ancestors. Sorry.
Thank you for reading that to us, Leona. I've heard you read it a few times, and every time I'm just like, it's like an exhale. And I love how both of your stories, help the reader, remind them of the importance of gratitude and all the bounty we have to be grateful for, and our responsibility and how we create a path forward. So I'm curious, how do you hope that your stories influence the hearts and the minds and the spirits of those who read them.
Is this for me or is it for both?
It's for both of you, so either one of you can, whoever would like to go first.
I'll go first. Yeah, it's always easier to go first. First of all, oh my God, I love your book. The words so powerful and just true by them being said, as it unfolds, the sentences unfold, and the illustrations are so impactful. I think that book, when it's read, it will make sense to all the generations. I think the children can read it, the adults are going to read it and be impacted just like I was. And I think, oh my God, this is so wonderful. So I really applaud you for that. I think that message that's going to carry on for a long, long time. I in my own case, always knew that a dialogue was important. That somehow in the course of the unfolding of our decades being British Columbians or Canadians, the walls of racism and hatred and prejudice and wrongful assumptions just grew unchallenged. And I think part of it was because we complied and didn't tell our stories anymore. And that's what you two beautiful ladies on the screen are so important. You're going to be part of, and already are a part of, telling the story that our neighbors, our non-Indigenous neighbors need to hear. They've been evolving throughout time with their own worldview and perspective that comes entirely distracted from our worldview, which is grounded in Mother Earth and everything it gives life to, the interconnectedness, the requirement for balance and harmony, and just sanctity in the universe. All of the little acts that we had in ceremony and dance and song were intended to create those special underpinnings for the things that we believe that were inherent in our worldviews, the value of children, the value of everyone, the value of everything, none of you. And I'm hoping my book will be read for a long time, long enough, over a generation or two or three, maybe four, where there's going to be a transmission of information and knowledge and understanding that should have been heard all along, but haven't been, but now can begin to be heard again. And with your voices and the voices of other Indigenous writers, authors are really important. I was a genuine author and the author for a long time. It's really important. And reading, for people who are curious and want to learn, reading is the tool really to empowerment, to engage the difference and separation and harm between us. If we can just reach a place of common understanding again, with that comes this idea of common humanity, that we suddenly recognize that we're all in this together, we're all interconnected.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah. Leona.
I'm swimming in in Robert's discussion right now. And the question is that you asked.
How do you hope your story influences the hearts and the minds and the spirits of the readers, and maybe those who are reading it to them?
For sure. And thank you so much, Robert, for that. I couldn't agree more. I think that the hope is that folks begin to see the interconnectedness because we've been so disconnected as neighbors, as people, disconnected to ourselves, more importantly as Indigenous folks. What we would like people to do and people to take away from this is that connection. And the passage that I really loved is, you know, be a good ancestor to yourself. And that's been really hard over these generations. But the hope that I have with Robert's books, your books, my books, all the amazing, incredible Indigenous literature that is out there, what I hope that it achieves is having our children connect back to themselves, and begin to living in a way. And I love, Robert, in our language, we have the word for Namiot, that it's called Wagoose. And it's a way in a state of being. This whole book, your book, my book, is about this idea of Wagoose. It's a state of being. It's everything that you do, everything that you are, from your thoughts to your actions to your interactions, all those pieces. It's all encompassing. It's this idea of holding yourself up, as you said it, as a person, holding up others around you, and hopefully then we're supporting each other in a really good way.
Mhm. Oh, I could listen to both of you all afternoon. One of the pieces that's in both of your books are visuals. And for me, whenever I go to the bookstore or the library and there's photos in a book, I'm like, oh, wow, there's photos, because it's part of how I engage in the story. So, and in Leona, in your beautiful book, you mentioned already Carla Joseph, the illustrator. I always say, especially working in schools, you have to say who is the illustrator as you read a book, because sitting there in your class or listening is a future illustrator. And if you don't uphold the illustrator, you really, one, take away some of the dignity of the contributor, but also the possibility of children seeing themselves as illustrators.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really curious, let's start with you, Chief Robert, around why did you want photos included in your book?
Oh, I'm when I sat down first time and I thought, well, I really got to get serious. I better write this book. I'm getting old now, and I don't want to leave this place without writing one book. I started thinking about it, and as I thought about the stories, I remembered photos that reflected times and circumstances in my lifetime that were important, that meant something special or unique to me. So as I was telling my story, I wanted people to see the images of those things that were important in my lifetime. For instance, I really wanted the reader to know that I really truly was born in a time different than now. In the North Vancouver Island, and I was reading the stats, I don't remember what they are now, but there were less than 100 or so newcomers in our area. So I really lived and breathed in space where there was just Indigenous us. In the conditions that we lived, they might have been poor when colonization began to happen, but we still had some remnants of the awesome sort of relationship that we thought we should have with each other, but with the environment, with the rivers and the mountains, and they all got stories to them, by the way, and about the animals that moved around the outside circumference of the village, the fish that jumped in the river as it flowed by the village, and so. Yeah, I remembered those things, and some of those pictures reflect some of those things. I wish I could have found a picture of a blackbird wandering around the village, but I didn't. But pictures are so important. I think it brings everybody to a focal point where they, oh, I get it, and they understand something about the narrative a little deeper because of the image that they see and the interpretation that they either see or would like to think it is, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you, because I know as I looked at your photographs and read your stories, I was like, oh, I remember that now in that picture. Or I'd go back to a photograph and go, oh, and then it just kind of helped me to unpack both the story and the photo a little bit more. They're like a really beautiful joining.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think about children's picture books, and years ago, I think it was 2019, I was in Prince Edward Island for work, and I was reading My Heart Fills with Happiness in a class that Julie Flett illustrated. And when I was done, this little person put up their hand, and they were so stoic. They were like, sometimes the person who draws the pictures tells the story better than the person who writes the words. So I think about that with the photographs, but the absolutely stunning illustrations that Carla Joseph has contributed to your book and Gabrielle's book, Be a Good Ancestor. And so I'm really wondering, Leona, if you could talk to us about, how did you feel when you first saw her illustrations?
Oh my goodness. That little person was absolutely right. She has this crazy ability to bring words to life and to make meaning out of them. And that is such a talent. And I just have to tell you, I was the vice principal. It was the first time I was a principal at her children's elementary school, and I met her. And I started working with her doing some art projects within the school. And then I realized she's just this phenomenal artist. And anyone who meets her, she's just an amazing human being. And way back when I said, Carla, I'm going to write a book one day and I'd like for you to illustrate it. And so this is the second book of mine that she's illustrated. She also illustrated A Dance Through the Seasons. And if you get to see that book, oh my goodness, they're all gorgeous. And so for Carla, I just think like it's so important to have a connection with the person. I love the way you gave me some advice to make sure that I'm able to connect with the illustrators so that it brings those pieces to life. There's pieces from both of our cultures throughout the both books, but this book specifically. And there's such complex ideas within this book. It amazes me how she's able to bring those pieces to life. The scientist in me, because before I was an educator, I was a scientist, the life cycle pieces, the ways, my favorite is the salmon. Salmon are such an important keystone species. I could go on and on about her ability, but and her contribution to this, but I just think, there's magic in illustrations, and what they give to a story cannot be undersold whatsoever. And you're absolutely right that we need to hold our partners in this work up for sure. And I just, there's not nothing I can ever do to repay her vision and her contributions to this work, because really without that vehicle of the illustrations, our words might be lost. I mean, we know and we see it in our minds, but for you to be able to connect to an illustrator who's able to then put it on a page and to do it more justice than you could possibly ever imagine. I'm always amazed at her brain and her vision and her ability to paint it.
Yeah.
We have a word in Quechua that says "sandwiched us." I'm impressed beyond measure. That's how your book was for me.
Oh, how do you say it again? When we say it again.
Sandwiched us.
Us.
Yeah. Sandwiched us.
I wrote that down. Thank you both for sharing. And Leona, you led us really beautifully for this question for Chief Robert. In your book, near the beginning, you talked about how bedtime was your favorite time at residential school, especially when you first arrived, because you could crawl into bed and imagine what mattered to you and remember what mattered to you. So I'm wondering, as you crawl into bed these days, what are you imagining for our future?
Yeah, it's a lot different from the experience of having to go under covers to imagine. And in those circumstances, even then there was so much fear around being caught that whatever you were imagining might be difficult, right? But when I think about now, if I went under the covers now, and I'm in my, what they say, it's a second childhood or something when you get old and you get feeble a little bit, but you still have emotion and it's strong and you still have memory. I think when I think about that time way back then, when I was a little child, and there was nobody around, and it was so lonely and so scary, that the only safe place in that entire big building, three-story brick building, and 200 other little kids who we didn't even get a chance to know each other. The only place that was safe was under those covers. In all of that 24-hour period, day by day, I looked forward to this brief time under those covers. Well, I'd like to go back into those covers now and think about what's coming, what's different, what's changing. And there are so many things that come to my mind, mostly about children. It starts there, that I see our little children growing up, being nurtured, nourished, loved, educated, and inspired to dream, never to stop dreaming. I see them walking hand in hand with their little non-Indigenous neighbors in some playground. And I see them sitting together in classrooms sharing our histories. And I see them coming to an understanding of Namuyut, that they truly, all of them are loved and cared for. And that indeed they are the most precious gifts to mankind that has ever been. And I see them growing up to be adults, prosperous, sharing of themselves, thinking about equality and justice, and making sure we don't ever do this again, so that we have a society that is filled with love for each other, and that we actually mean it. We celebrate that togetherness and the understanding and the embracing of each other. It's going to be, and I just want to say this, it's just my opinion. I have no science behind it. Reconciliation is underway in this country, and it'll never go back to those dark days again. There'll be incidents and other things that challenge us, but we have in this moment our children growing up now to create the environment of reconciliation that will indeed transform our families and communities and this country. Right?
I feel teary listening to you share. Yeah, I find it very moving. So thank you for sharing your imaginings and speaking the future so that we can all take steps to make it reality. You know, on Friday, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I had said no to things, but there was a request that came in from the United States to do 2 class visits. And they were in classes where the population was 80% Indigenous learners. And for the first time in their district, they were doing some curriculum around residential and boarding schools. So I said yes. I was not prepared for my emotions, because when I came on, there was 20 classes in the state of New York, all in orange. All of those children were in orange. The educators were in orange. And I was like, wow. Like I had to really breathe to be able to be present to share, because I was so moved. And I think about, you know, those who have carved paths, like you are, Chief Robert, like Phyllis. Had Phyllis not shared her story, right? About her orange shirt.
Yeah.
You know, the collaboration of your work, of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of the work of Phyllis, the work of citizens. One, we probably wouldn't have a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And everywhere I went that day, there was orange. I mean, it was just, I have never experienced a day like that. I was so moved and close to tears most of the day, and they would trickle out. And it was a really beautiful day. And it makes me think about how you said, Leona, you know, you said to Carla, one day I'm going to write a book and I want you to illustrate it, right? Both of you have been talking about speaking that future, right? Your imaginings, you just shared with us, Chief Robert, about the children. And so I have this piece here, Leona. In Be a Good Ancestor, you and Gabrielle have a page that says, be a good ancestor with your thoughts. And I'm wondering if you could share a time with us, and maybe it's even the present time, when a thought you had became an idea and fostered change.
I actually want to share, well, I'll share that passage, and then I'll give you my example, because it's something that I'm currently working on, and it's going to be some of the most important work that I'll ever do.
Beautiful.
So be a good ancestor with your thoughts. Thoughts become ideas, ideas become actions, actions become movements, movements become change. I love the empowering message behind that our thoughts are so powerful. We know this. And that's why we have to put positive thoughts out there, because it could become positive change. And some of the work that we're currently doing within our district is around Indigenous girls. We're trying to rematriate our girls into taking up those roles of leadership, those roles, those cultural roles within our communities that have been lost through colonization, and we see it. Bob, you talked about, I'm just calling you Bob now, Robert. My grandpa was Robert.
Call me Bobby Joe. That's what everybody calls
Bobby
me.
Joe. Oh, it's Bobby Joe. Okay. So Bobby Joe, you talked about the rites of passage, and traditionally all children, and especially girls, would go through a ceremony through the rites of passage. And what we're seeing is that, and you know, where we live in the central of British Columbia, along what's called the Highway of Tears, tremendous amount of loss, tremendous amount of loss of our women. And so the idea that we have, the thought is that we need to rematriate our girls, and having them remember those traditional historical roles that we have within society. Women are at the center of a matrilineal society. Everything we do, you know, Bobby Joe and I talked about clans, it's through our mothers, and some of that has been forgotten. Not all, there's still some very traditional families. But the idea is that we create programs within my sphere of control, within education, to instill some of these ideas. The rites of passage for Indigenous girls usually takes a year, and you're guided by your aunties, the females in your matriarchy. And so what it does is it gives you these ideas around leadership, self-care, your connection to community, mental health, like all these things are included, things that we see as being real issues for all of our children were done through these rites of passage. And so the actions, we did some research with our girls, just ask them, what do you need? What's going on for you? And we soon realized that because these rites of passage, these things have been lost through colonization, that our children don't have those necessarily, and some of them are lost and they feel lost, and they've told us through their own voices that this is how they feel. And so we're going to start recruiting, because the change is that we hope if we lift up our girls, we're going to lift up our nations. And we know at the center of our society is women. And that's not necessarily what happens in patriarchal societies. And so if there's one thought I had is, how can we do better for our girls? What we're hoping to see is a community change by empowering young women within our society and giving back their voices that have been lost.
And so do you have some ideas of how your steps for that?
Yeah, we have come up with this sort of scope and sequence around the year. We've taken direction directly from the girls. So we're not giving them, you know, we've asked them, what do you need? And then we are bringing in folks. I'm in my town specifically, we have major towns within our district, but in my town specifically, I'm, you know, walking my talk, and I'm leading that group, and I'm being that matriarch for these young girls, and we're instilling them. So whether it's, you know, leadership, like different things that they would go through, like for an instance is self-care. 1 year you're taught how to do things in a good way because you have so much power as an Indigenous female, and so much about society has disempowered us. So how do you honor that power? How do you harness it? And how do you turn it into good for the community? And the name of the group, the matriarchs in our community, we wanted to name it something, but it was way too spiritual and only belonged to our community. But the funny thing is one of our matriarchs, Louise, now Dr. Louise Lessert, she said, how about Hundayan? And we're like, what does that mean? And she said, it's only used for women. And the only English translation is sharp like a knife, but it doesn't mean that literally. It means sharp-witted, sharp, razor sharp. She goes, I don't know how to explain it, but I'm trying to explain a state of being for women. And this word is only used for women, and that's Hundayan. And it's that with-itness that women have in their place within society. And I said, that's perfect. I need our girls to find their Hundayan and the essence of that. Yeah.
And the essence of that. Yeah. Our girls and other generations of women as well, hey? Yeah, thank you. Oh, I'm curious, and this story might already be in your book, Chief Bobby Joe. I'm gonna call you now. For each of you, and again, you can decide who wants to go first, but what's one of the favorite stories from your life that would give us an insight to who you are?
I think I was a foster child most of my life. My father died when I was 5. It wasn't your typical sort of fostering out. It was to family members. So when my father died, I got fostered out to my mother's father, my grandpa, but he died shortly right after that. And I ended up being a foster child to another chief, Chief Tom Dawson, Kwayimzi, big whale. That was his chieftain name. And I spent 2 years in his home away from residential school because he built an Indian day school in Kinka Inlet. So I went for the first school that wasn't residential school for grades 7 and 8. But during the time I spent at Kinkham Village, this wonderful human being, gentleman, chief, was just so kind and gentle. I knew all the time that while I was under his care, that he was not my father or my grandfather, and he made that clear too. But in that context, he made sure that I was always loved, paid attention to, involved, connected to his family. And through the doing of that, he taught me many, many things, including ordinary day-to-day instruction. he caught me packing wood one day. Oh, actually, it was 2 pieces of wood. He said, don't do that. Don't do that. Put that one down. Don't be lazy. You go and you bring one block and you go and get the next. When you get tired, you stop for a while and you rest and your energy comes back. So he had some really practical advice on how I should grow up, to be honest, to be truthful, to be caring of others around the village, right? Were really important teachings. But over the course of my lifetime, and because of my experience in residential schools, I came out of that school really haunted by my experiences, my memories, and I had a tendency, whenever that happened, to drink a lot, and it's just progressed over time. And I remember when I was trying to struggle with this, I remember Tom Dawson in a big house talking to all the young people and their parents, but mainly to the young people, saying, we are more than driftwood, my children. Everybody younger than the chiefs was always their children, right? That's how much they cared for him. And I heard that. And I didn't know I carried it for a long, long time, to the point where I was so near death. And I heard this voice that sort of pulled me out of that trajectory, right? And the other thing that he said after that first sentence, he said, we are all born into purpose. You got to be born into your purpose. Seek it, find it, discover it, but don't let, and he was talking about the new ways and the new people coming, don't let them destroy you. And that's the most, aside from some lessons I learned from my granny, that was the most important lesson in my life, sort of. My life, really. It's in the book.
Yeah, his presence is very present in your book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that beautiful, I mean, in there, I feel like you've given us a basket of gifts in that story. Yeah, thank you.
That's what we call the box of treasures. Eh? Yeah.
And how about you, Leona? What's a favorite story from your life that would give someone an insight to who you are?
I think this was my favorite story. So one of my great aunts, my grandfather Bob, his sister Catherine Caldwell, but as I was growing up, she was Catherine Bird, and she was, my great aunt. And I went to public school. My mom made this decision, and I didn't realize until this last 2 years how profound this decision was. She told me, she's like, you're going to that Nadeau school, which meant white school, because no Indigenous kids went to that school. And it was the public school within my own district, Sauche Elementary. I never knew until this last year how profound that decision was. She sent me to that school, and they were actually way ahead of their time now that I think about it, because my great aunt was a teacher there. She was the carrier language and culture teacher. And I had carrier language and culture from K to grade 4 until I moved away from my community. And part of her curriculum, she didn't call it a curriculum, but all of us children, and she taught everybody. This wasn't just the Indigenous kids being pulled out. This was everybody. So everyone in our community of Fort St. James, Nak-Asli-Wut, and got the benefit, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, of my auntie's teachings. And I just remember myself being curled up in this school, and I loved going to school, which again, I've had to reconcile this in the past year, because I've learned through my family's experiences that mine was very different. And there's been a bit of reconciliation in my soul about that, because for me, and there's privilege in this as well. These are huge epiphany things that I've had to think about this in this past year, the privilege of having school being one of my safe spaces. And it was because my aunt was there, it made it that safe space. So I just remember myself, you know, I don't know what grade I was really young at the time, so either 5 or 6. And I was curled up at the knees of my great aunt, and she was telling us creation stories. And it still is one of the best stories of all. And it's how the trees got their markings. And she starts out and she goes, when Creator created the earth, she said, the trees used to move. They went from here to there. They went everywhere that they wanted to. And then one day they broke out and they all looked the same. She said, at one point, all the trees looked the same. And then she said a great war broke out between the trees. And there was fires and there was thrashing, and she went through each species of the trees, and she goes, that, you know, the poplar, they got burnt in the fire and they're ashy. And she was like, kept going through all of it. And Creator was so angry because they had so much freedom that he gave them the lesson. He cemented them in place, and they'd have to live permanently next to each other to be in harmony. I'm telling you the short version because I know we sat there for quite a while, and she was quite the storyteller. But I remember thinking, and you know, my love of story was from that. Her and my grandfather on my father's side is pure Irish, and he'd tell me about fairies and leprechauns, and both of them told these stories like they were true, like they were happening. I never thought of these as fables or fiction or anything. These were true things that happened. And so you can't imagine how excited I was when I watched Lord of the Rings and saw the trees walking around. I was like, oh my goodness, there's my auntie's trees and they're going to war. And so I think the reason that's so important to me is that I you know, the richness of our culture, I had this young appreciation and access to our culture and our stories, and I realized how important they were. Everything had a story, like how the lynx got their little wisps on their ears, and you know, the trickster stories. We have a trickster in our local area, and you know, and it was just so wealthy. But that one story for me was just so fantastical that it never left me. And I think what's most important is that in a classroom, I seen my great aunt, and she was our teacher. And even at that young age, I knew how important that was. And it's had a lasting impact on me. And she's a matriarch of our community. And it was just amazing. I can still picture it to this day. It's so vivid in my mind.
Wow, it's vivid in my mind now too. Thank you, because you're a very gifted storyteller.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to open those of you who are joining us virtually. If you have any questions for either Chief Bobby Joe or Leona, to put them in the chat. We've got a few more questions, and we hopefully will get to some of the questions from those of you joining us. But I'm going to ask this question of each of you, and that is, how do you see stories as a form of medicine?
Leona.
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Bobby Joe. I was giving it great time. I think stories are the medicine. I think we've been telling a story about Indigenous folks, about non-Indigenous folks, about who we are as a country for a very long time. And as Bobby Joe had said, that story is beginning to shift. And the medicine that we see is now the diversity of voices who get to contribute to that story. So the way that I see it as medicine in this country is that it's this beautiful woven fabric of the collective. And once we get to the point where we're all held up, where all our words matter, all of us get the same time and the same energy and the same voice, that's where we'll see things shift. Because all we are, as Bobby Joe has said, all we are is story. You've said it, Monique. You know, we were a story before we came into this world and will be a story long after we leave. And so I think what we contribute to that story, that's where the medicine lives.
What we contribute, that's where the medicine lives. I'm going to think about that on my walk. Beautiful. Thank you. Just before we hear from you, Chief Bobby Joe, my apologies to those joining us. I thought you needed to put your questions in the chat, but they need to go in the Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I'll come back with that question to you, Chief Bobby Joe, is how do you experience stories as a form of medicine?
Yeah, I'm thinking back a few years, back in the 70s, Umista had just repatriated all of the old treasures that were confiscated during the anti-potlatch law. And we had a big celebration in Alert Bay. And Umista is the institution that it is now. And all the elders, the great chiefs of that time who had now grown very aged, were there. And while they were extremely happy about the treasures coming home, returning to their place of origin, I could see the sadness. Just take away the sadness because somebody says something is right or does something good. We got to process that hurt before we can remove the sadness. And that's a real therapeutic process that we're going through countrywide now as we hear survivors and others, not just survivors speaking up anymore about colonization, but all of us talking about the injustice and the racism and the brutality of it all, taking children away. And so narrative, telling stories to each other, deepening our relationships, regaining an understanding around the insanity that's happened is important. And that's one of the most powerful processes and medicine that I know. Unless we begin to talk to each other, we're not going to become balanced or well. And it starts with self. If you want to be better, I think what we all ought to do individually is to look at the idea of reconciliation as a core value and say to ourselves, can I do that? Can I adopt this as a core value and begin to build out our own reconciliation action plans for individuals? And then we reach out to the family and then a community and of course eventually the universe, but it's all about reconnecting humanity, starting with our own families, our own tribes, and then reconsidering the arrival of newcomers to our country. And it's all a process that we need to examine now, to be a part of now before we can right relations, if they were ever right. But before we can create conditions that give every child and every person a sense of meaning and purpose and belonging. So it's really, really powerful medicine. It's the best medicine we got going for us. It could actually save civilization eventually, because there are so many things going on around the world now that and good results. So it starts with us, it starts with our family, our own community. Let's do it. And then when we're able, we reach out and we work with the others who are neighbors now and just keep working on it, one person at a time, one generation at a time, whatever it takes. That's what we get.
It makes me think about, because both of you have, because of the beauty of who you are as human beings, you have quite the spheres of influence, each of you do. And so my curiosity is, how do you take care of you so that you can keep walking in a good way that upholds yourself and upholds the dignity of others?
I'm gonna jump in before because my answer is not quite there. When I was in a residential school, 11 years, I was really broken down to zero, down to darkness, however we describe that. And I really wanted to belong. I really wanted to be loved. I really wanted to be part of it all. My family, my peers, everything. And I didn't know how anymore. But miracles happened, and at some point in my life, I got a job that brought me to working with people, and the trajectory of my whole life changed. My goodness, I can work with people even though I'm just a broken son of a gun from a residential school. People allow me to work with them, and then I remembered some of the traits of Chief Tom Dawson and my Grammy. They never abandoned their humility.
Mm.
And I think that in all the work that I've done or ever am going to do, I keep reminding myself it's a privilege and an honor, and I better maintain that sense of humility, because the door can close just as quickly as it opened. Humility is a really powerful characteristic to hold. And because I felt so unloved in my life over time, especially in the school, when I learned to love myself, I finally got it. That's where we all start with love. We can't love anybody else unless we love ourselves, right? And then when we learn that, we can love fiercely, with complete abandon, and people know that. And so humility and love are really important core values for me.
Oh, that's so profound. I'll just jump in, Monique. I think you're talking about self-care, and it took a long time for me to get to a place where I reached out for help. I reached out for, take care of my mental health. To my body was screaming in all sorts of ways, saying you need help. And it was my mind that was causing all of these things. And, getting to the place, and absolutely, Bobby Joe, is self-love is paramount. One thing that I've learned in the last 2 difficult years that we've had is that every single person in this country is on this journey of truth and reconciliation. And it's not in the grand scope of it all. It's this individual pursuit of reconciliation, because we all have to reconcile something. We know it. That adds to the grand truth and reconciliation, is these individual journeys. And so the way that I maintain balance is I take it one truth at a time. And I take my time. And it's this cyclical piece, because I think that what people think of, and this is where the medicine comes in, is that self-paced self-actualization that you were talking about, Bobby Joe. And so we can't do it all, but we can individually do our little pieces. And it really does begin with the self. We can't ever hope on healing this entire country as a whole if we don't do the work for ourselves. That I know to be true as well. And so when those truths are a little bit too hard, because there'll be ones that are difficult to absorb and to process, I give myself time, patience and time. In our province, we know about the First Peoples principles of learning, and that's the one I always go back to, that everything takes patience and time, and I need to give myself that time. It took a while to get where I am in my healing, in all my experiences, both positive and negative. I've learned to slow down and appreciate my healing and to live in it. Our world is really fast paced, but we definitely need to give ourselves that time and to absorb those truths. And on the other end, it's so beautiful once you have acceptance and you move through some of those harder truths. It's definitely beautiful on the other side.
I have time. We have about 6 minutes, so I'm going to ask 2 questions in closing. We have a question from Susan M., who's joined us. Just wondering if or how newcomers' stories can be told so that they are in constructive dialogue.
I'm going to jump in. This is something I learned working with survivors for over 2 decades. I sat in so many circles around the country, and those circles widened from time to time and included faith-based groups, sometimes other, I hate the word ordinary citizens. And it fluctuated between the mix of those two. But one of the things that we agreed to really early on, and it was through dialogue and discussion and talking it out, was, and especially in healing circles with survivors, and they always said, we need a safe place to have dialogue. They didn't want to talk about their history and their stories unless they felt safe. And so the next question, of course, was, well, how do you, what kind of space is that? Who makes that space? And it was really obvious from the beginning that the only people who could make that space were the people in the circle who were sitting there, who would will themselves through protocol and ceremony, a prayer, smudge, whatever they chose to do, whoever was in the circle would adopt protocol to infuse into the space so that people could feel safe. And that was a major breakthrough for me. I thought, God, this can work. And then there was a larger circle that I was involved with. And this comes when things are really difficult and challenging. This was right in the front end of all of the residential school exposure. The government was panicking. There were 80,000 people who were survivors, had various issues, and they could cost the government a lot of liability. So they were responding because of the liability. But one of the things that happened was that there was a process convened across the country 7 times where survivors, Indigenous leaders, church people got together. And the question was really simple. Look, we really need to talk. But how can we talk with all of the hurt and harm and hate and everything else? And so the goal was to find out what could we create as a narrative that would carry the work of residential schools through all of the government levels and church levels and survivor levels. And they came up with a national protocol. There were agreements, actual elements that said, we agree to abide by all of these rules. They weren't rules, they were principles, values, stuff like that, in all our meetings. And sure enough, as we began having meetings across the country, there were some really, really tension-filled meetings where sometimes safety was a concern. But I noticed over the course of that time that nobody left the table. They stayed. Even the ones who were mad and angry, they stayed. And eventually it led to all of the agreements that have been around for a while now, the settlement agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission agreement, and others. So it can happen in that space where we commit ourselves to some level of courtesy and respect for each other, even though it hurts sometimes, you know.
I think I have a few. I mean, that's incredible. And I always appreciate you sharing so much of your knowledge, especially because it comes from a personal place, Bobby Joe. I think what I would add for Laura's sake is that even though you're a newcomer, a lot of the information that's being shared is new. We're just learning it, we're relearning it as we speak. And so as a newcomer to this country, I think I wouldn't want to dictate anything, but to give you some advice. To be in dialogue also means being an active listener. I think listen first, listen to what you hear, listen with your heart. If you're having a reaction, a heart reaction, digest that and really think about why you're having that reaction to what's being said, and be supportive. I have to do this when I'm in conversation and in dialogue with people who've gone through what Bobby Joe has gone through, is to be a listener, be an open ear, and you're learning right alongside the entire country. You just got here, but a lot of what we're learning, the difficulties that I had alluded to, I'm learning things about my family that I didn't know. And in this past year, it's been a tough thing to take in and digest. This is my own partner, my own mother. There's truths that are being learned. So the best thing that you can do, and the thing that I actively try to do, is to be an empathetic listener. And that really is how I try to be in dialogue when I'm hearing about these things and learning them for the first time.
I could listen, and I still have, a page and a half more of questions, but our time has come to a close. And I think that, all of the sharing you've provided for us, the stories you've told us, the reminders how stories are medicine, and just in closing, as you shared, the importance of listening, right? That the stories that survivors, the stories that human beings have, always have messages and learnings for us. So I offer so much gratitude to both of you for the gift of sitting with you this afternoon, to being witness to you, to your stories, to reading your beautiful books, your important contributions to literature. I look forward to what you create next. And I offer each of you such immense gratitude for your stories, for your presence in our society, and for the important work that you're each doing to contribute to the wellness of the world. Hi, much gratitude. Thank you. And thank you to all who joined us this afternoon. Enjoy this beautiful day. It's a gift. Matakiwas, all my relations.
Masai, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for attending this panel. Thank you, all the panelists, for sharing your stories and your medicine with us. So yes, thank you to the moderator and the authors, Monique, Grace Smith, Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, and Leona Prince. Thank you again for sharing everything with us today. Let's see, if to our attendees, if any of you are interested in purchasing one of the books featured here today, please support the festival sponsor and VFA bookseller, Monroe's Books. You can find the books featured here during the festival in store and online at monroesbooks.com. There are a few more events during the festival, so please visit our website, victoriafestivalofauthors.ca, to view our festival program. This year, most festival events are available online. Our website also features Q&As with all the authors participating in VFA 2022 and a place for you to sign up to our newsletter. If you would like to support the festival in another way, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and encourage your friends to attend one of our upcoming events. You can also make a tax-deductible donation to the Victoria Festival of Authors through our website or on VFA's page at Canada Helps. Your donations help to keep the VFA an engaging, accessible, and sustainable festival. We hope to see you at our next Zoom event, Climate Acts and Land Sings, today at 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. This event features authors Tawaham Bish, Alessandra Nakarato, and Julia C., and is moderated by Rita Wong. Again, thank you for coming today. And as Leona said, as Monique said, please enjoy this beautiful day. Thank you again.